Bom dia, boa tarde, boa noite, or whatever the case may be. My name is Marcus, and I am the host of the Black Brazil Today YouTube channel, as well as the creator of the blackbraziltoday.com blog, where I analyze Brazil from the perspective of race. Today, I want to revisit an article I put up way back in 2014. Again, some of my articles are from some years ago. Obviously, this article is almost 8 years old, but it's another piece that I think is vital and necessary to understand uh, the way that Brazilian racism functions. People often wonder, or better yet, when we go back to the 40s, 50s, and 60s, it was this, after World War II ended, UNESCO started sending various scholars, anthropologists, sociologists, to Brazil to study how Brazil had achieved this so-called racial democracy when other countries with multiracial societies were always in the middle of some conflict. And what they found with these social scientists coming from Europe, United States, and from Brazil itself was that, in fact, Brazil did not achieve any sort of a racial democracy. When they started talking to people, analyzing the statistics, just studying the condition of Afro-Brazilians, they came to the conclusion like, wow, we can't call Brazil a racial democracy because in many ways the black population here is living far worse than was in some ways worse than what you saw in South Africa and Jim Crow United States. But even so, you still had this dynamic where a large percentage of the population bought into the idea that Brazil didn't have race problems. And it was just kind of like it's kind of like yelling at somebody like, look, monkey, there's no racism in Brazil. It was just kind of like that. It's like people would experience racist comments, gestures, attitudes every day and still be under the idea that, well, we don't have racism here. That's a thing of the United States, right? And I was fascinated by how can that happen? It's like when you read enough of the books, some of the books that I was reading were books by people like Florestan Fernandes. He was a famous sociologist. I believe he was from University of Sao Paulo. And he had a couple books that were available in English, but most of his work was available in Portuguese. And I was amazed at some of the stuff that he was talking about in his books about like blatant, open, just racism. But yet, how did this country manage to build this image that it didn't have racism, even with all of these books out there? You know, um, American scholars, Donald Pearson or Carl Digler or God, who are some of the other people? In more recent years, I would just say in the last 20, 25 years, you've had scholars like Kim Butler, you've had people like Michael Hanchard, um, many of Brazil's own scholars just openly just debunking this idea that there's no race problem there. But it was still intriguing to me that a lot of people, even having experienced blatant racism in their faces, they still believe that, racism wasn't a Brazilian thing. Oh, you're trying to import something that happens in the United States that has nothing to do with Brazil. I'm like, how did they get away with this? Honestly, I was fascinated by that. You run into people who just tell you like, no, we don't have those problems here. So the reason why I wanted to choose this article today is because these are two main pillars of how the racial democracy myth stood the test of time for so long among the general population. One was a lot of people who you and I might look at and say, well, that's a black person. They were taught like, no, you're not black. You're just you got a really deep suntan from being out in the sun too long, right? And the other side is again people believing that even in the face of all of this racial discrimination, that no, we don't have that problem here. And so these are two prominent people that I was talking about in this article, and they just talked about their experiences with not only a lack of black identity in the case of one, but also the disbelief that racism actually existed in Brazil, right? So this article from 2014 is called From Denial to Consciousness. One didn't know he was Black, the other denied the existence of racism. Two Afro-Brazilian militants tell their story. So um, stories like these, they really resonate with me because it's like, how did this happen? It's like, how could a myth be this powerful where in the United States, in general, people born in the Black community, born of even one Black parent, they grew up knowing they were Black. Um, and nobody was going to deny that, you know, the United States openly, it was just open. Everybody knows that the United States has had racial problems for years. So I was just fascinated by seeing, or better yet, to know how this type of thing, this type of ideology could bamboozle so many people. Now, as I've explained this in previous videos, how things have changed drastically in Brazil. I mean, it's like it's been something for me to witness it because, you know, dealing with Brazil for 20 years, I've met people who I would consider Black who would just look me in the eye and be like, no, I'm not Black. I'm a Moreno, you know, I'm a mestizo, right? And I would meet people like, well, we don't have any racism in Brazil. Like, just flat out tell you that. So getting to see these two stories of these two well-known militants, it was, again, it was fascinating to me because they told their stories about how they were buying into these two mythologies once upon a time in their lives. One of them is a very prominent NGO leader. Frei Davi is his name. He is the head of this NGO called Educafro. Educafro is an NGO. They call them ONGs in Brazil, ONGs they call them. And his organization has helped probably tens of thousands of Black and poor students have access to universities. They've provided the courses to help them study for the vestibular, you know, the college entrance exam. It's often that college entrance exam that holds people up from being able to get into college because they don't score high enough. And you know, the Brazilian education system works in a way where people who have money spend money from, say, first grade to high school, so to prepare their children to be able to go to the free university. So then what happens is that the Black and the poor population, they go to the public school system, which is Brazil's public school system is like probably in the probably the lower half in the world of, you know, public education systems. I'll have to look that up, but I think they were between like the 80s, 90s, or the 100s. I have to look that up. I don't remember. It's been some time since I looked at that, but it's always been, people have recognized like the public education system in Brazil is just not good. So well-to-do people will pay, you know, thousands of reais per month to send their kids to these prestigious grade, you know, elementary and high schools to prepare them to study for the vestibular, which in turn leads them to being prepared to get into the finest and free public universities. On the other hand, Black and poor people who study in public schools often find it difficult to try to pass the test to get into the university. And oftentimes these people who don't have funding have to end up to try to getting money to pay for private, costly private universities. Right. It's an intriguing setup there. I've known people who have tried to take that vestibular test like several times and just never managed to get through. Some people, you know, take 2, 3, 4, 5 times to try to pass that. You know, like, again, it's the vestibular, it's the college entrance exam. So this guy has been instrumental in helping just probably tens of thousands of people get into the university by now, probably, you know, giving them college prep courses. And the other lady, Jurema Batista, is a well-known politician from Rio de Janeiro. So I want to get into their stories because they exemplify so much the brainwashing that a lot of people were under for so many years in Brazil, where, you know, it's changing now. More people are identifying themselves as being Black or at least of African ancestry, and more people are not buying into the idea that racism is something from another country. So anyway, let's take a look at this article. In the last 80 years or so, Brazil successfully promoted itself to the world and Brazilian citizens as a racial democracy in which there was no discrimination based on the concept of race. With this propaganda, the nation was able to effectively neutralize any sort of widespread anti-racist movement to challenge this hegemonic mythology. In fact, as we highlighted here in a previous post, with a goal of eventually erasing the Black population from the midst of the nation, top statesmen supported the idea that, at least in the census, there were to be no more non-white Brazilians. Now, I spoke about this in a previous video, where they get to the point like we want to get rid of all the category had all of the. There was once upon a time when they wanted to get rid of all of the color coded categories on the census so that everybody would just be seen as white. Now, understand there's 5 color categories in the official Brazilian census for Black, white, brown, Asian, and indigenous, right? But was the idea. Eventually, they just wanted Black and brown people to disappear through widespread racial mixing, in which people were encouraged to marry and reproduce with whiter skinned people. I also want to clarify that Brazil has had social Black rights movements for years. From what I've seen, they just were never just very widespread in a way that people associate with, say, the civil rights movement, in the mid 50s to, say, the early 70s. But it has always existed, from the 30s and again in the 70s, and then you have the modern movimento negro, the Black rights movement. Basically, it's always been there. It's just nowadays, it's in the last few decades, its popularity and its agenda, its demands for the Black population has spread more among the general population now. So this is a Brazil that, by official census figures, was at least 63% non-white late into the 19th century. Again, like maybe 10 to 16 years before the ending of slavery, they found that this country was like 63% non-white. With this propaganda campaign, millions of non-white Brazilians were indoctrinated to, 1, avoid identifying themselves as Black, and 2, to deny that widespread institutional racism existed in Brazil. And this undermining, what we'll say, the undermining of Black identity. This is a well-known journalist here. One of the articles I put out, where it was just an interview with her, where she says that traditional media in Brazil massacres our Black identity. So it's like everywhere you look in Brazil was trying to undermine people identifying themselves with being Black. Brazil has done this. It's been miraculous how they've indoctrinated so many people to run away from being Black. And there's a number of articles that just discuss this. This is just one of the pages here. But again, then you have the other side talking about this myth of racial democracy. And here, there's a famous anthropologist who's he's actually from the Congo, but he's been in Brazil probably, I don't know, maybe 30 years or so, if not more. He says the myth of racial democracy is part of the education of the Brazilian. That's Professor Dr. Kabengele Munanga. Again, he's from the Congo, but he's called Brazil home for 2 to 3 decades, if not more. And his work has been an important contribution to understanding how these race relations work in Brazil. So basically, he's just saying, and I can confirm this, I've talked to enough people over the years where maybe not this generation now, but their parents' generation, people just grow up being taught, number one, that if you're Black or brown, you should mix with somebody who's whiter to have lighter skinned kids. And number 2, racism is not a thing of Brazil. It's a thing of the United States. So people, it worked miraculously because many people were living under this myth. And I would say that, today, even though some people still like to give some credibility to this idea, most people know that race is a serious issue there. Even if it's the funny thing how I had one article up that said that basically 92.1% of the Brazilian population was ready to admit that, yeah, we have a racial problem, but then only 1.3% were ready to admit that they themselves were actually racist. It's an intriguing thing. How this racial democracy myth continues to live, even as it's been thoroughly debunked for 70 years now. Anyway, as an example of how successful this propaganda campaign has been over the years, today we present 2 prominent figures in the anti-racism Black consciousness movement, revealing their personal journeys from denial to militancy. The profiles and interviews are taken from the 2010 dissertation O Mundo Negro, a Constituição do Movimento Negro Contemporâneo no Brasil, which basically means the Black world, the Constitution of the Contemporary Black Movement in Brazil, 1970 to 1995, that was defended at the Universidade Federal Fluminense in Rio de Janeiro in 2010 by Amilcar Araújo Pereira. The study was later released in book form. So the first study here, the first story, first interview that I'm featuring here is Jurema Batista. She was born in the city of Rio de Janeiro on August 9th, 1957. She was founder and president of the Association of Residents of Morro Andaraí in 1980. And that year, she entered the letters course of Universidade Santa Úrsula that she concluded in 1983. She participated in the founding of Nzinga, Coletivo das Mulheres Negras, or the Collective of Black Women, also in 1983. She was a councilwoman of the city of Rio de Janeiro for the Workers' Party for 3 consecutive terms, 1992 to 96, 96 to 2000, 2002. I have to look that one up because I think she was in the middle of that term. I have to see if she actually concluded that. But anyway, she's a well-known politician in the city of Rio, with this last being interrupted halfway through when she was elected state deputy for Rio de Janeiro. In 2 terms, she was president of the Committee for the Defense of Human Rights of the municipality. At the time of the interview, she held a seat in the Legislative Assembly of the state of Rio de Janeiro, where she presided over the Commission Against Discrimination and Prejudice of Race, Color, Ethnicity, Religion, and National Origin. For many Black women activists in Brazil, their main political reference is the late, great Lélia Gonzalez. In her interview, Jurema Batista also reveals how Lélia Gonzalez influenced her. Now, I've already spoken a little bit about Lélia Gonzalez, but she's a very important figure in the Movimento Negro movement itself. When Angela Davis had come to Brazil a couple of years ago, even she had mentioned, like, she has a lot to learn just from studying, Lélia Gonzalez, a very important figure in Brazil's Black rights movements. So, Jurema Batista, this is her talking here. I became a president of the Association of the Residents of Morro Andaraí in 1980. That same year, I was at Faculdade Santa Úrsula, or the Santa Úrsula College, and the racial issue was not in my mind. We had the Luiz Gama Academic of History Center, which was run by a group of Blacks from the state of Bahia. One day I was going there. I was going to debate, and they invited me. It's to debate about this situation of Blacks. I said, me? I don't want to know about this. Are you going crazy? They said, because there is racism in Brazil. I said, what racism? Where is it that you invented this stuff? This was the only thing missing. You're bringing things from the United States here. We don't have this problem here. No, only in South Africa. Then the class started. Pretty soon, a Rastafarian came in my room and said, come on, we're waiting on you. It will be a wonderful debate. I was dragged to the debate. I got there, and who was at the table? Carlos Alberto Medeiros, Lélia Gonzalez, and this guy who was calling me into the room, which later came to be my advisor in my first term as counselor and was murdered, Hermógenes. I got there with Carlos Alberto Medeiros, talking that way in which he spoke. And on top of that, he was handsome at the time, just fine. And Lélia speaking in that way that she spoke, wonderful. That blunt way she spoke, passionate. Now, Carlos Alberto Medeiros is another really important figure in Brazil's Black social rights movements. He's a well-known journalist. I've known Carlos for a number of years. I think I met him for the first time maybe in 2014. We had some email contact for a number of years when I think I had read a book by Michael Hanchard, and he spoke much of Carlos Alberto Medeiros. And, he's a friend of mine, I can say. Matter of fact, Carlos's birthday just passed on August 4th. I always call him. I forgot to call him this year, or I always leave him a message because, just to wish him a happy birthday. But Carlos is just one of those people that's just really good to know. He's documented Black history in Brazil for a number of years, and that's he's just a guy who he's just really important in the whole movement for Black Brazilians. He has spoken in depth about this is another thing. Maybe in another article I can get into that, but Carlos spoke on how the first time he saw Ebony magazine, because remember, I did a video well, a couple of weeks ago talking about the 25th anniversary of Brazil's most successful magazine targeted at Black Brazilians called Raça Brazil. So in Carlos Alberto Medeiros' day, you just didn't have magazines that featured Black Brazilians. So when he saw Ebony magazine, on a newsstand, and he saw, Black people from the United States with these afros looking beautiful, he was infatuated. He felt about Ebony magazine the way I felt when I first saw Raça Brazil magazine. It was like, wow, these are our people, right? So one day I have to talk more about Carlos Alberto, but let me keep this moving. So anyway, so what you're seeing here is that Jurema Batista, she says that she didn't believe like racism. What are you talking about in Brazil? Are you crazy? There's no racism here. That's United States. That's South Africa, right? She goes and listens to this. She starts getting involved in these lectures and these debates about race in Brazil, and she starts to understand like, whoa, maybe there's something to this. This is just a very common story. A lot of people go through many years in Brazil believing this race is not a problem until somebody, wakes them up, right? Okay, so continuing. But I fought with her emotionally. I said, that woman is going crazy. Where does this woman get this? There was a lot of resistance, but at the same time, she said something that touched me so deeply that I got to go where I knew she was. If I knew this, Lilian Gonzalez will speak at the Getulio Vargas Foundation, I would go and listen. Then I understood everything. It was just then that I became aware of the racial issue, and I was very angry. I was a militant pit bull because I was very angry. Later is when I understood this, including in a psychoanalytic process, because I was deceived. Very key point she's making here. My entire life, I drank in this history that in Brazil there was no racism. When I discovered that there was, people would make denouncements, and I began to see. Actually, I lived in the favela. Favelas are like slums on the outskirts of major Brazilian cities. And I saw how the police treated people, what their level of education was, etc. I lived there in the cauldron and knew that that was true. So something struck her where it turned her whole disposition on the issue of race in Brazil, just completely turned her around when somebody laid down the facts for her. So if this happened to Jurema Batista, you can imagine how many millions of, I'll say, would-be Black and brown Brazilians who are misled to believe that this is not an issue in their country. The next story is again from about Frei Davi. He was born in Nanuque, Minas Gerais, on October 17, 1952. When he was a year and a half years old, he moved with his family to Vila Velha in Espírito Santo, another state in the southeast of Brazil, where he was raised. He entered the seminary of the Franciscan Order of Guaratingueta, Sao Paulo, and graduated in philosophy and theology, and participated in the formation of Black pastoral agents. And since the mid-'80s, has served in parishes and the Baixada Fluminense region of Rio de Janeiro, where he participated in the creation of the pre-college exam prep course for the Black and we'll say underserved and needy in the early 1990s. At the end of the 1990s, he founded Educafro, all right? It's education and citizenship and Afro-descendants and the needy. That also acts as a pre-entrance exam prep in Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo. In 1994, he was elected to the Latin American Executive Secretariat of Afro-Latin America, or Afro-Latin American and Caribbean Pastoral. He participated in the coordination of the collection in Negros em Libertação, Blacks in Liberation, of the Editora Vozes publisher. So, what intrigues me about, and I had visited, spent quite a bit of time just hanging out at the Educafro offices in Sao Paulo, and had some conversations with Frei Davi, very spirited, very passionate person. But what struck me about learning about his story is that you look at Frei Davi, and you just think about it for a minute. It's like, okay, this guy tells his story about how at once upon a time he didn't know he was black. And I'm like, he's not dark skinned per se, but he's dark enough where, I don't know, you got that Sherman Hemsley, George Jefferson complexion going on right here. And it's like, how could this guy go this long not knowing that he was black? Or perhaps he was just in denial. But that was something that was just fascinating to me because, again, you just don't hear stories like this in the United States. People generally know from the time they remember, like, yes, we are black. But I really like the story that he told because if this is his story, you can imagine that there's probably millions of other people who had the same story. So anyway, the episode of the awakening of racial consciousness, as told by Frei Davi, one of the most well-known characters in Brazil with regard to the implementation of policies of affirmative action for Blacks, is especially instructive in terms of his subsequent political career as a Black militant. So this is him talking. I entered the seminary, and in my first class there, I packed my suitcase to get out. I entered in March, and on May 13th, the class, most of whom were of German and Italian origin from southern Brazil, invented a commemoration of the Golden Law in the cafeteria at noon. They took a table, they put it in the middle of the cafeteria and made it like it was a slave ship. And on that day, the Black seminarians should sit at the table for lunch. It was a slave ship table, a tribute in the form of a little joke that they were going to do with Black people. And as I never imagined myself Black, I always saw myself as someone queimadinho da praia, meaning a little burnt from being on the beach, on the beaches of Espírito Santo, again, a southeastern state, and not much more than that. I thought I am moreno, meaning dark, mixed, brown, whatever, because I'm more from the beach, period. I didn't assume my Blackness. And then in front of this fact, a very difficult climate was created. In truth, I never took it upon myself the mission of sitting in that middle table. Usually I sat on the side tables like the rest of the whites. And at playtime, someone shouted, "Wait a minute, there's an empty chair. Someone's missing. It's David or Davi." I can't remember which one is how his name is really spelled because a lot of times I see it without the D and it's Davi. But either way, then there were a half dozen big German boys pulling me by the legs and arms and putting me in the chair in the middle of the table. I said, "Wait a minute, you're offending me publicly. You are attacking me. You're calling me a Negro in front of everyone. That's an assault. I don't accept such a thing." And so they let me go in the middle of that table. I stuck my hand in a jar of water, dropped a couple of glasses, broke some things, and left. I went to my room to pack my bags to leave. So if you see what's going on here, first, let me explain what he's talking about, this joke that was going on. Okay, May 13th is the day in 1888 where slavery was officially abolished in Brazil. Brazil was the last nation in the Americas to abolish slavery 25 years after after slavery ended in the United States. So they were making a joke about, let's set up a fake slave ship, right? So he was the butt of the joke. And notice how he says he usually used to sit with what he called like the other white people. So he's seeing himself as not Black again. And again, you see in here where he says, "You're calling me negro, you're calling me Black," which is an insult. So we can clearly see where Frei Davi's head was at that time. He saw himself like the rest of the guys, most of German and Italian descent. He didn't see himself as Black. So let's keep going. And there was a trainer who was a very well prepared, very capable, very strategic guy. I was already packing my suitcase and he said, "What happened?" I said, "They called me Negro." Again, negro in Brazil is the word. They use that word for Black. They called me negro, assaulted me. So I'm offended and I'm leaving. He said, "All right, but if you want to go, go. But do this. Stay until at least tonight so we can talk. Let's talk a little bit. I want to know a little bit more of what's happening. Afterwards, you go. There's no problem. You want to go? Go. You're an adult." At night, I went to his room after dinner, and he created a very tranquil environment. "Who was your football or soccer team?" I said, "Flamingo." He complimented Flamingo, and suddenly he said, "Do you have here a picture of your mother?" I said, "Yes, I do." I reached in my wallet, took out a photo of my mother, and showed it to him. He looked. "Your mother is white?" I said, "Of course." I'm white. My mother has to be white. Listen to what he said. He says, with the guy, obviously the guy who's talking to him was surprised to see that his mother was white because, Davi doesn't really look what you would call quote unquote mixed. He looks like a black guy. He says, your mother is white. He says, of course, I'm white. Thus, my mother has to be white. He cut the subject, and once he realized I was totally relaxed, he posed the following question. Do you have a photo of your father? I said, no, I don't have one. No. He said, you don't have one? I said, yes, friar, or frei. In Portuguese, frei means fire, friar. I have one, but it's there in the suitcase. Go there and get it. I said, but the suitcase is already closed and I'm ready to go. You will go. And I want to at least see the photo of your father. It's obvious where this guy is going. He's looking at Frei Davi and he's looking like, dude, you're not white. Let me show you something. So go. He shows a picture. He proudly shows a picture of his white mother, but then he plays like he doesn't have a picture of his black father. Again, how deep does this indoctrination process go? So I opened the bag, dug deep, and got the photo of my father, brought it and showed it to him, completely humiliated. He was humiliated by going and getting a picture of his obviously black father. I mean, let that sink in for a minute. And he said, your father is black. Then there was a general shock. I stopped, didn't leave. I didn't move neither forward nor backward, nor did I sit down. He took a glass of water and said, what's happening? I couldn't speak. And he said, look, you suffer from a very serious illness of which you are not to blame. You suffer from an extremely dangerous, contagious disease. It's called the ideology of embranquecimento, meaning whitening. Again, I've talked about whitening before. It's not only the process of seeing a black family become white over successive generations through mixing with white people, but embranquecimento is also something whitening of the mind, where you see everything from a white perspective. You see yourself as white. You see white as superior, right? So this is a white guy who's telling him this. You're a victim of the ideology of whitening. And only you have the remedy to overthrow this disease. If you don't work, if you don't attack this disease, it will ruin yourself altogether and you will always be a suffering person. I said, and what's this disease like? He said, this disease causes the person to reject his people, his race, his ethnicity. He pointed to himself. German, I read books in German about my people every week. Everything connected to German, I'm reading, or everything connected to Germany, I'm reading, studying my culture, my people. I'm feeding and maintaining. And do you do this? Davi responds, no, sir, I have never read a book about blacks. And there began to awaken in me an odd question. Damn, my father is black and he never said anything about blacks to me. Then I started to do the reading, go back in history. My father practically neutralized the children in his family. That is, we were all born without knowing his family. He distanced himself from the family and instead connected to my mother's family, which is white. I began to understand how it developed in us, in me, and in my siblings, the rejection of the racial question. So much is going on here. I mean, think about this for a minute. There was another story where I was telling about how oftentimes the black parent in a racial relationship kind of like bows down to the white partner. He or she doesn't want to have anything to do with their black family. It's like they put whiteness on this pedestal and they only want to connect with white people. They connect to their white spouse's family and just totally ignores their own family. So in this context, if you see this going on around the time that Frei Davi was born in the 1950s, this was very common. Black people wanting to whiten themselves through interracial marriage or whatever, wanting to produce, lighter skinned kids, not wanting to have anything to do with black culture or anything to do with black history, because in the brain, they were taught you don't want anything to do with blacks. You have to be an upstanding citizen, which in their mind meant being white. So the other thing that you catch here is that this is a white, I don't know if he means he's from Germany or he's of German descent, because this is going on in Brazil. There's a white German guy telling this guy, like, look, you've been brainwashed. You don't know anything about your people. I am German and I learn everything I can about my people and where I come from. It was only at that moment it's really crazy to me that Frei Davi came to start analyzing and accepting himself as black after a conversation with a white man of German descent. I mean, that's just really deep. He didn't get the acknowledgement that in fact you're black. He didn't get that from another black person. He actually got it from a white person of German descent. Again, when you go to southern Brazil, you have a lot of white Brazilians who are of German descent. You know, so many famous models. That was a story that came out some years ago. How a lot of modeling agencies was going to the south of Brazil because that's where they could find. You know, the three most southern states in Brazil is what they consider the European section of the country, where massive immigration from Germany and Italy settled in those three states. So these what people who were looking for new models would go to southern Brazil because they were in search of that European phenotype. So anyway, this is just phenomenal to me because it takes a white guy of German descent to sit Frei Davi down. Obviously, he wasn't Frei at that time. I think he was studying to become a friar, but he gets not acknowledgement and reinforcement that he's actually black from a white guy. That's fascinating to me, right? You're like, you've been brainwashed. You got an illness called the ideology of whitening. Only then did he start to catch on and see, okay, maybe there's something I need to consider. Continuing, in 1976, I began the awakening of racial consciousness, critical reading of race relations in Brazil and how very poorly resolved it was, how much it was a source of damage to life, because the beautiful is the person loving himself as God created him. And if I experienced it, I began to wonder, how do the rest of blacks live? How do the rest of the blacks live? And I found that all the black people of the seminar, there were few, there were 8 with me, also denied their racial culture. And I began in society, in town meetings where I went, trying to get close to black people and touch on the black theme. And I found that out of 10, 9 did not even want to talk about this subject. Then I realized that the rejection was in an overt degree. It was a problem, a national problem. I decided that from then on, I didn't want to be Franciscan because South Francisco or St. Francis has a proposal of life and has a project of society. I wanted to be Franciscan because I wanted to put this structure of the Franciscan church to the service of a subject that is not being dealt with very well. That is the question of black people. So another thing to look at what he's saying here is that he's talking about 1976 when he's starting to become conscious of his racial condition, the history of how black people are treated in Brazil. And so he wants to talk about this with other black people. And what he found is that most people didn't want to hear it. He's saying 9 out of 10 people didn't want to deal with anything that had anything to do with black culture, black people, the race issue, anything like that. So this is what I'm saying. In 2022, Afro-Brazilians have come a long ways because this is what, less than 50 years ago. I mean, it's arguable. One could argue that this was still true in the 1980s and 1990s, and it really started to shift somewhere in the 2000s. I would say, particularly in the second decade of the 21st century. But this was pretty common. Black people not wanting to deal with their blackness, denying their blackness, and just buying the rhetoric that Brazil doesn't have racial problems, right? I don't know how that struck you, but when I know that his story applies to so many millions of people, we get to understand how there's such a wide variance of how black people perceive the country to be. When you have so many people who going through the same thing that Frei Davi went through, you can understand how it's not possible to know how many black people live there because so many people are living in denial. Like I said, you take a look at Frei Davi himself. I mean, you look at this guy and it's like, how can you not know you were black? But again, I have a friend who always says, indoctrination runs very deep. So from where he came from of not knowing he was black, being ashamed of his black father, being disgusted and feeling like he was being insulted by being called black, to become one of the most important black leaders in the country, he's helping probably tens of thousands of black people have access to a college university education. So these two stories, they just speak volumes of how it is to grow up in a country that teaches you that you're not black and that racism doesn't exist. So anyway, these two stories are really good just to keep in the back pocket, so you can just understand when I go forward talking about other people's stories, and this struggle of coming to accept a Black identity. Again, for people who might be from the US, like, you've always been Black, you've always known it. It might sound kind of strange, like, how can people not know that they're Black? But this is what happens in Brazil, not even Brazil, but just Brazil, but a lot of countries in Latin America, where this whole thing of the cosmic race, the mixture, you're not Black, everybody's a mestizo, right? Is rampant in Latin America. So, Latin America may have many more Black people than we actually know. It's just so many people are in denial. This is slowly changing in Brazil, but it's still an issue that people deal with on a daily basis, coming through and actually coming to accept a Black identity. So, with that said, I'm gonna conclude this video here. If you like this piece, definitely give me a thumbs up. Definitely leave a comment in the comment section. Just tell me what you thought about this story. Which one was more fascinating to you? If you like this video and others, definitely consider subscribing to the channel and clicking on the notification button so that you'll know when I create more videos, because I want to try and keep them coming. So hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you in the next one.